From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 273, recorded live Thursday, June 30th, 2011. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. In this episode, Scott talks with open source developers Anthony Hoorn and Nik Molnar about the Glimpse project.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today it's the Glimpse guys. We've got Anthony Hoorn and Nik Molnar on the phone talking to us about Glimpse. How's it going, guys?
Doing well, Scott. How are you?
I am fantastic because I'm talking to you guys, my favorite open source people. I met you guys, where was that? Was that Mix that we met?
It was at Las Vegas at the Open Source Fest at Mix 2011.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, the Open Source Fest was fantastic because that was John Papa's little party that he had that I personally thought was going to be very small. And then when I showed up, it was full of just tables and tables and tables of really, really cool open source projects. And I saw finger tracking on Connect, and I saw profilers and libraries and JSON parsers and all this kind of stuff. And then Phil Hack grabs me and says, "Oh, dude," because he talks like that. "Oh, dude, you have to see this. Oh, my goodness." And I ran over and he says, "Check this out." And then he starts showing me some stuff that looks like Firebug. Basically, he opens up a pane on his browser and starts, clicking around on tabs. And I'm like, okay, that's lovely. You're showing me Firebug. And then he starts selecting text over it. Like he selects text on the web page and then drags into that div. And then I realized that I was looking at something that was implemented entirely on the client side. And then my brain exploded and it leaked out of my ears and we all started yelling. And then you explained what it was. So one of you guys, I don't know if you're in the same room, maybe you can decide, explain to me the elevator pitch for what Glimpse is.
Sure. So the elevator pitch for Glimpse is basically a way to understand what's happening in your web application kind of on the server. So Firebug is a good analogy from a UI perspective. It looks very similar. And Firebug does a similar job. It gives you information about what's happening on the client side, your HTML, your JavaScript, your styles. Glimpse will tell you that same kind of information about server-side considerations, such as which views are being picked up from your view engine if you're using MVC, or what the request data was, or some information about your environment, like what process it's running in, or your configuration. So we get lots of rich information that helps us debug and diagnose certain issues that you might have with a website, or even just find ways that you can tweak and performance enhance what's going on in your site.
And when I saw Glimpse for the first time, I noticed that there was a whole series of tabs, and then I clicked on a couple, and at the time, I was told by the tool that these things were not implemented. What's the plugin architecture underneath?
Yeah, so basically what we've got is, out of the box, we've tried to think of what plugins would be the most useful for someone who's working on the, let's say, ASP.NET platform, because that's what we decided to target at first. And out of the box, because we both do a lot of MVC, it was kind of like we were thinking, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could see, routes directly in the browser, within the context of the request that we've just made? Or wouldn't it be cool if we could actually see the execution pipeline? Because as of MVC3, the pipeline is actually, it can be quite dynamic in terms of you've got filters coming into the equation and, at a page level, at a global level, or a control level, and so just trying to get an overall picture of what's actually going on, it can be quite tough. And for the ones that weren't implemented at that time, probably the trickiest one for us, more from a UI perspective, was the binding tab. And that was the primary one that we had, not implemented yet. But since then, we've actually, and probably a couple of weeks after the Open Source Fest, we managed to, I think, get the UI right on that one. And that's what we managed to implement. And so really, everything that you see there to date is kind of like, what have we found useful in our day-to-day jobs? and what do we think other people, would find useful in that context. In terms of a plugin architecture, we really wanted to kind of come up with something that was really simple, even from our point of view, because we've been experimenting with at the time with different data that we wanted to show, different context data. And, I think it was Nick who came up with a great idea that, why don't we use math? And it was kind of like brilliant, because then what we could do is we could just get people to implement a standard interface, which is dead simple. Basically, you receive a HTTP context and you return an object, and that's it. So you can do whatever you want with that HTTP context. And remember, this is just on the .NET platform. This is the implementation details on the .NET platform. Or you do, like, for instance, in a routing situation for a routing tab, we pull out all the routing information that we need, and then, put that into a dictionary structure or an array structure and return it. And that's it. The rest of the Glimpse framework picks that up.
Okay, let's do this. Let's back up a little bit and think about how this thing is architected and generally how it works. So what I do is I go file new project and I make an ASP.NET MVC application. I go into NuGet and I say install package, and I just say Glimpse, right? Or do I have to say glimpse.mvc or something?
So you have the choice. We're leveraging the dependencies features of NuGet. So you can do just Glimpse if you're using a web forms project, or glimpse.mvc3 if you're doing an MVC project, and that will pull down the dependency on Glimpse by itself, which is kind of the core engine.
Okay.
We like to think of MVC as a plugin pack that adds additional tabs, and we could foresee us and other people shipping additional plugin packs to add more on top of the framework.
Okay. So then I run my application and it looks the same, right? I don't really do I know right off the bat that I've installed Glimpse, even if I've just installed it and hit run, or do I have to turn it on?
No, so that's a great question. So we have to turn it on. So we made the decision that this kind of information, this diagnostics information that we're showing, shouldn't be there on every request. It does represent a minimal amount of overhead for the request. So we wanted to find a way that the requester or the user of the site would say specifically to give me this information on every request. So the way that we've done that is we actually use a cookie. And to make setting that cookie really easy for you, we have a HTTP handler called glimpse.axd. So you can browse to glimpse.axd after you've installed Glimpse via NuGet, and there's a giant button right there that says Turn Glimpse On. That's simply setting a cookie for you. Once you go back to your website, you'll then see the little evil eye staring at you of Glimpse that has all the information that you're looking for.
Okay. And by the evil eye, you mean that there's literally this kind of little picture of an eye. It's an all-seeing eye that sits in the corner of the browser. And this is a div, right? This is a little piece of HTML and some JavaScript that's been injected into the page. So my page should work as before. It shouldn't work any differently. But you've changed it dynamically. You've done something on the server side to inject something in that has then presented itself on the client side.
Yeah, exactly. So on the end of the request, we actually append what it is we need, which is just, again, through some extension work that we've done with glimpse.axd. You can actually, if you just go glimpse.axd, you get the configuration page. But if you go glimpse.axd ? And use the query string, we actually serve up other assets through that same AXD. And so in this case, when we see that the request is finishing up, we actually inject the lines of JavaScript that we need to load Glimpse up. So what you'll actually see if you view source on your request is we've dynamically added this the HTML elements that will get your browser to load up Glimpse into the end of your request. And once that's there, and the client finishes loading, we use jQuery to detect when the page is finished loading, and then we load up Glimpse. We render it. And from an architectural standpoint, on the client, the Glimpse client is just a really fancy renderer. I really think that's the best way to look at it. So what we've done is when we send down the data from the server of, let's say, the payload, which is the data that you want to see, it's just a JSON or a JSON structure. It's just JSON data. And from that, what we do is we interpret that data and render the UI based on the data structures that you've used. And that's what's going on under the hoods on the client, if that makes sense.
Okay. How does this div that renders prevent, how do you not mess up other things? One of the things that I've always been surprised about with Glimpse is that I haven't had any trouble with the different versions of jQuery that I use, and I also haven't noticed that it looks right everywhere. It somehow, no matter what I'm doing from a markup perspective, you're not screwing up my markup and I'm not screwing up yours. How is that possible?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. It wasn't easy. To get an initial cut for the open source fest, we managed to do reasonably well. But when we've gone to the plethora of different websites out there, and we see what people are actually doing and what they're doing with their styles, we've had a pretty tough time. So just to back up a little bit and, add a little bit of a story to this, essentially when we were looking at how we wanted to display the UI, originally we were actually going to do it as a Firebug plugin. And when we were doing that, we thought there were several benefits to that. The fact that we wouldn't have to create any base infrastructure. We were leveraging something that people already knew. And, the majority of web developers use Firebug anyway, and there was a pretty rich platform to build on. But when we're actually sitting down and actually looking to create the plugin, maybe it was just, our skill sets, but it didn't seem like a simple endeavor just to create a plugin for Firebug. And we thought that, we're then tying ourselves to Firefox. So just to get started, I think it was me who just said to Nick, hey, let me let me see what I can get up and going here. Let me see if I can just get some sort of basic, HTML injected into the bottom of the page here and rendered out. And then later on, we'll do the proper version. Kind of thinking along the lines of what Firebug does, how they've got Firebug Lite and then you've got Firebug Proper. And so let me just see if I can get this basic core version out, and then we'll worry about the full version later on. Because we're under a huge time crunch and that's another story, but we wanted to make something in time for the Open Source Fest. We had 5 weeks that we gave ourselves. And so we start off with this light version, and what I found out very quickly to tie it back around was that getting the styling right so that, nothing that the client was doing was a real challenge. And when I looked at how Firebug was doing it, they're actually, for Firebug Lite, they just have like a little div at the bottom of the page that they then render an iframe into. And that iframe, because it's not part of the core HTML of the hosting page, that there is no, let's say, cascading of the styles down into that div. So that's how they get away with it. Whereas we'd already headed down the track of just injecting the HTML. And so it was like, do we back out and go to an iframe approach, or what do we do? And so in the end, what we experimented with was actually doing a CSS reset on a scoped region. So imagine that instead of just doing a CSS reset on the whole page, let's do a CSS reset for anything that's within the Glimpse class. And so that's what we did. And so basically we reset all the styles just using like a basic CSS reset that is widely available. Which, if someone's floating all their divs to the left, would set them back so that they're no longer floating within this scope. And then we start applying the Glimpse-specific styles on top of that. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm. Now, but I'm trying to understand, though, I can see the idea of doing a CSS reset for a scope region. That's pretty interesting, actually. But if how do you keep from conflicting with other CSS classes or divs, IDs, things that I might use, right? What if I make something called, the glimpse thing?
Yeah, so everything's prefixed. And so we've kind of made an assumption that you're not going to have any classes called glimpse-something or other. And that you're not going to have any IDs called glimpse-something or other. And so given that principle, we haven't been bitten yet by anyone saying that the name of my company is actually Glimpse and you're interfering with all of my classes. But unfortunately, it's one of the challenges of developing this kind of thing for the web and taking the approach we have that, there is the potential that we could run into someone's toes at some point. But the prefix that we've got is serving us pretty well to start with at the moment.
I see. So it's you're taking a chance that some company called Glimpse International doesn't really want to jump in and collide with you, but ultimately the prefix is what's saving you.
Yeah, and to answer your question about the jQuery, how do we get away with that? At first, we made, and this was in time for Open Source Fest, we made an assumption that, most people use jQuery. As it turned out later on that, not everyone uses jQuery, and they were running into some issues, and we wanted to support those people, and that there is still a fair bit of difference in some of the versions of jQuery. And so that presented a particular challenge. And so what we've actually done, and I'm not sure if I'm 100% happy, with the approach, but it works, is that we've actually taken a copy of, let's say, the jQuery source code, and we've actually, when needed, we embed it in our JavaScript file. Okay? Mm-hmm. And what we do is we've purposely, to avoid version collisions, is we've modified that jQuery source slightly so that instead of jQuery trying to go window.jQuery and ours trying to override that, we've actually changed a couple of the variable names that are scoped at a global level to be like jQuery glimpse and the $sign to be $glimpse so that we can actually get that version independence. Does that kind of make sense? And so, yes, I guess in theory, it could sometimes load two versions of Glimpse on the one client, which I guess there is a little bit of performance overhead of that, but it's not used when a normal user is using your site. It's used in the context of when you're wanting to debug and diagnose a problem that you have. And getting a consistent experience for people and not telling them, hey, you've jumped ahead further in jQuery versions than we have, or we've gone further than you have, and having a really inconsistent experience. That's how we kind of got to that point.
This episode of Hansel Minutes is brought to you by Careers 2.0. Careers 2.0 is a new service by our friends at Stack Overflow. You're probably all familiar with Stack Overflow, the online Q&A resource dedicated specifically to programmers and programming-related topics. Well, the team at Stack Overflow created Careers 2.0 to provide you with access to great jobs and introduce you to a bunch of great companies that you might consider working for, even if you're not currently looking for a job. Think of Careers 2.0 as a programmer profile. It gives you a platform to show that you're awesome by featuring your proudest contributions to Stack Overflow, GitHub, SourceForge, Bitbucket, anything programming related. You can even add your favorite programming books from Amazon.com. Profiles on Careers 2.0 are free. They're easy to get started, especially by importing your LinkedIn profile. However, there's one catch. Profiles on Career 2.0 are invite only. They did this to keep out the spam and have a high-quality environment. Fortunately for you, as a Hansel Minutes listener, I've got your back. Head on over to careers.stackoverflow.com/HM to accept your invitation today. Once again, that's careers.stackoverflow.com/HM. I hope you like it. Okay, let's shift to the server side, because the thing that's most interesting about Glimpse, I think, once you move past how you use HTML and jQuery is the relationship between the server and the client, because Glimpse gives you insights into what's going on the server that is disturbing to me, because it's just a huge amount of information. It's almost as if you guys have said, let's just show them everything. Like every single piece of data that is available on the server, you're looping through all the different collections that have anything interesting and then organizing it in a very neat way on the client. It seems like, one, a huge amount of information, and two, is that not a little invasive isn't the word. Is it a little slow to do all that on every single call? I want to understand how you're getting all that information, like where your hooks are in and how you're moving it to the client. And, if I should worry about all that pile of information that you're sending back and forth.
Yes, that's a great question. So the server-side architecture, so the plugin architecture sits on top of MEF, as Anthony had already mentioned. And so
MEF, of course, being the Managed Extensibility Framework. Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry, Managed Extensibility Framework. So there's really two main pieces to Glimpse. We have now our HTTP handler, which we already discussed, which is where you go to turn on Glimpse. And that's also kind of the endpoint that we have access to serve up any other resources like our icons or our JavaScript file, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also have this HTTP module. Now, the module, we try to be very, very efficient inside of there, because that's really kind of what's scraping all of the information out of the runtime during a request to put together the JSON blob that the client will later render. So what we have done is we have an entire pipeline of what we call validators, and that basically bails out of Glimpse doing any work as soon as we know we should bail. So, for example, as soon as we know what the content type of the request is, if we're returning an image, Glimpse can't really help you out with your images, and we're going to bail. But if you're returning text/HTML, then we know that there's some work that we can do there, because you're probably running through a view engine or something like that. So we've tried really hard not to just take all of the data that we had access to and dump it out, but instead try to solve real-world problems, issues that we've run into in the past. I know that I actually get to teach people how to use MVC quite often, and I see them run into issues with routes. I see them run into issues with binding and understanding child actions and things like that. So we've kind of taken some of those experiences that we've had, plus a lot of feedback from the community and Twitter in general, and built those pieces of information into the UI. So the way that we actually hook in really isn't a testament to Glimpse at all. It's really a testament to some of the recent work that the ASP.NET team has been pumping out, really. I mean, all the plugin points were there. We didn't invent anything by any means. So in general, we either wrap or extend hook points like the iView engine or iModel binder, and just kind of sit in the middle so we can see the parameters that are being passed into those methods by the framework and the results that are coming out on the other end. And then we throw away any data that we don't need to try to keep things efficient, and then send that down at the end of the response.
And is this all just AJAX back and forth? This is all just JSON, like one giant JSON call, or 50 different JSON calls that's pushing information back and forth?
That's a good question. So we are very mindful of performance, particularly from an HTTP standpoint, and we try to reduce the number of HTTP calls. So as of right now, and there's some debate going on internally about whether or not we should change this, but as of right now, when you make a request, all that we render out to your page is two script tags. One's inline and basically has the JSON blob with all of the information, and then the other is the script tag to go back and get our JavaScript client. And that will go through some caching layer, HTTP caching, so you don't actually have to re-request that after the first time. So there's no AJAX going on at all to get the basic Glimpse. There are two tabs, however, that start to really play into AJAX, and that's the AJAX tab and the remote tab. The way that those work is we actually take all the metadata that we're sending down on the page response, and by default, we'll keep the last 15 requests to the server in memory. And then, so for example, the remote tab, when you've selected it, we'll make an AJAX request to our HTTP handler endpoint that I described earlier, and return back information about previous requests. So you can start to maybe compare the request you just made with the one that you made a couple of minutes ago, et cetera, et cetera. And then same with the AJAX tab. If an AJAX request is made to your server, we can't append a giant JSON blob on top of that because you're probably already returning JSON or an HTML snippet, something like that. So instead what we do is, I kind of like this, I think it's kind of clever. We take the ID, the glimpse ID of the request, because we assign a unique ID to every request that comes in, and we add that to an HTTP header on the response of your AJAX request. We can then, using the same HTTP handler endpoint, take that ID and say, give me all of the metadata for the request that came in before with this ID. And then that's what we render and show you in our AJAX panel, so you can then kind of launch and attach to that request and see all the glimpse information in its UI.
Okay, so this is almost like changing the channel on a TV set?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's like changing the channel. You're selecting which request you want to look at. By default, we're going to show you the one that your browser just made, but it could be one that JavaScript made on your behalf via AJAX. It could be one that was in the past that you made 3 clicks ago. It could be one that another user entirely has made. So really interesting scenario that we haven't documented well, which will allow for me to maybe debug something that's happening on a mobile device where the Glimpse UI is not necessarily going to work out. Or if I have a user call me and say that they're experiencing a problem, I can watch them as they're making requests and attach to one of their requests remotely and see what's going on. So it's just like changing the channel, except the channels here are requests over time.
Could I open up multiple windows and have my main page in one window and then some AJAX over in another?
So I don't follow you. So you want to have your main
I want
page
to debug.
on one.
I want to debug AJAX and I want to debug my main page at the same time.
Yes, yeah, you could do that. So what you would do is we actually have a UI feature that would allow you to pop Glimpse out, and it literally just opens up in a web browser pop-up window. So you can move that over to one window, and then you can open up the Glimpse panel in your main page, and now you can be looking at AJAX in the pop-out and looking at the main page and still in the div.
This might be a weird question, but it just kind of came to me. Why do you think that this hasn't been done before?
That is a good question. So, to be honest with you, I think it has been done before, not in this exact implementation, obviously, and not really for the .NET community. When Anthony and I were discussing starting to build Glimpse, we looked at some other tools that are out in other web development frameworks. And a lot of those frameworks that have this kind of tooling, like PHP and Cold Fusion, have tooling similar to this. That tooling is because the server-side team of whatever framework built in some diagnostics that somebody then later just went and built a client for. I feel like that was the holdup for ASP.NET. I don't think there's really this diagnostics information built into the framework. It was available, but nobody was collecting it and gathering it into an easy-to-consume format. That's all we've really done with Glimpse, plus a really nice client and a decent extensibility model.
Okay. How many people are working on this? And I'm curious how long it took, because it seemed like I think a lot of people would agree that it came out of nowhere. And it was very...
Yeah, well, this is I hinted to it before, but it was funny. We were actually standing outside of a subway and one night, and we were talking about, cool things that wouldn't we love if we could have this. And, Nick started talking about, back in the day, when I was doing Cold Fusion, we had a tool, where you could actually see details of your request. And, I was like, wow, wouldn't that be cool? And, this was pretty much probably 8 weeks, maybe, before Open Source Fest. And, probably a little bit before that. And it was when we figured out that John Popper had just announced that, they were looking for more project submissions to Open Source Fest. So probably before that, we'd spent maybe 3 weeks. It had maybe been 3 weeks since that conversation outside the subway to when the announcement of that John Popper made. And from when we knew we were accepted, we had 5 weeks to finish Glimpse, or at least get it to a decent point that we could actually demo it to people. And so we actually had a very, very short period of time. And so from it was 5 weeks basically. And at that point, Glimpse was just a GitHub project. I don't think anyone was watching it. And we were just doing our commits, and it was just myself and Nick. And when we came to Open Source Fest, we'd literally been spending every night from probably the time we got home at 6 or 7 o'clock until like 1 or 2 in the morning, trying to, pump in the functionality and trying to really get a compelling experience, because we wanted people to use it. Plus, for ourselves, it was really going to be a benefit. And then at Open Source Fest, and put it this way, without Open Source Fest, I really don't know if it would be where we are today. That platform, I think, is a phenomenal idea for the .NET community, and probably other communities as well, although I think they've got similar sorts of things, but especially for the .NET community to showcase things. And when we went there, we were totally unknown. We're an unknown project, but that wasn't the criteria. You didn't have to be a known project. You could just admit, hey, I've got this cool concept or this cool project. This is what it is. I'm happy to show it. And so that's what we did. And as soon as we started talking to people, it was like, wow, because they hadn't seen anything like this for the .NET platform before, and it was like, this is really cool, and it's really simple to put in my website. I don't need to change anything, which is one of our leading principles. Unfortunately, you still need to make a slight modification to your web config to say that you want Glimpse turned on. But, besides that, it's not like I've got to change, what handlers I'm using or, what implementation of, iView you're using for, MVC or whatever else. It just works. And I think when that clicked for people that, here's data that was extremely difficult for me to get to see in aggregate before, in summary before, and I'm just seeing it now for every request, and I've had to do nothing except reference this DLL. I think that really resonated with people. And, I remember when Phil Hack was walking around the tables, and, I purposely walked over and grabbed him and said, hey, I think you'll find this interesting. And, it was so funny because he took it was 30 seconds of me talking and him looking at the example that we were showing, and it just clicked. And, I think he was pretty excited, or he seemed pretty excited at the time. And I think that's when he said, I'll be back. And that was when he ran over to you. And likewise, within a very short period of time, much shorter than I expected, you just got it. And you saw the value of it. And, and that's why I think it really took off. And the other thing that really helped was NuGet as a platform. It was the right delivery mechanism at the right time. And, the fact that people could just go, they could find it, and just through Visual Studio, just add it to their project, that just worked. And so I think people really loved that.
Very cool, very cool.
And in terms of contributors, Nick?
Yeah, so Anthony and I have done, a lion's share of the work, especially in those 5 weeks where we didn't get a ton of sleep before Open Source Fest. But we've had great community support. So actually the night of Open Source Fest, a guy came up to us and said, hey, I'm not really a developer, but what you guys are doing looks awesome. Can I make you a logo? And so literally that Monday night, we were up with this guy until about 2 in the morning. His name's David Stubbs, and he put together what I think is a pretty kick-butt Glimpse logo. We've had another gentleman named Peter Handorf who has done a fantastic job writing documentation for us and contributing that back to the website because he said he loved Glimpse but thought, it needed better documentation, and we completely agreed. We actually have I would say a decent ecosystem built around Glimpse as well now. So I'm looking right now in NuGet.org, and there's 8 to 10 different plugins for Glimpse available to download. I know of at least 3 or 4 others on different sites. And so somebody like Stephen Lowers, who built a Elmo plugin for Glimpse, so you can see all of Elmo's information right in the Glimpse UI, has come back and even worked with us to say, hey, it'd be really great if Glimpse supported paging of data. And so we're trying to find a nice generic way to fit that into the framework and move forward with that. So we're getting some pretty good contributions from the community, whether directly to the core or just to the ecosystem and adding their own plugins.
And you'll be seeing versions of Glimpse for all other other platforms that aren't ASP.NET at some point, it sounds like, too.
Yeah, so essentially what we've done is, at its core, if we go really pie in the sky and think about what Glimpse is, the way we like to think about it is that it's just a framework. Okay, it's a framework that people can develop plugins for, and that if those plugins return a particular data structure, which is all documented, and which renders out in the Glimpse protocol, which the Glimpse protocol isn't anything fancy or whatever else. It's more like OData in the fact that OData is just a set of conventions that allow you to interpret meaning from the data that's present. So if we see a plain JSON object that's in the data packet that's been sent down to the client, we'll just render it as a key value table. If we see a complex array of arrays, then we'll display it as a multi-column table. So it's just this framework, and if you send down the data in this format, the client will render it out. Okay, and you get that for free. So that's what makes it really easy for people to develop plugins under .NET, because of Meth particularly makes that really easy for us to pick up extensions and whatever else. Now, I think that concept of having something that's, an overarching framework that facilitates people easily writing plugins, and then this overriding framework loops through those plugins and says, what data do you have available for me? And then serializes that into JSON and includes it as part of the payload, and then uses the same generic UI that we have. That to me, at least, that makes a lot of sense on other platforms as well. Because even though we've mentioned that PHP may have similar sort of tooling or whatever else, they don't seem to be as rich necessarily as what Glimpse is, or necessarily targeted the same way as Glimpse is, in terms of overall, diagnostics and, debugging. And so that's what we really, we've started, to really look at, is there a good story that we can provide, let's say, for Node.js? Could someone or us develop, that overarching framework that queries a bunch of plugins and says, what data do you have for me? And then includes that as part of the payload. And once that's developed for that platform, it doesn't matter what, MVC framework they happen to be using in Node or whatever the flavor of the moment is or whatever else. It's a really simple architecture that people can plug into. And to me, and to Nick, that seems to make a lot of sense. And so at the moment, our focus has definitely been on .NET. But, we've had interest from people who are like, when is this coming to PHP? When's this coming to Ruby on Rails? I want the exact same ease of creating a plugin that I have under .NET for Glimpse as I do in PHP, or Node.js. And that's a story that we're really interested in, and one that we're trying to get traction on as well.
Well, cool. It's a very exciting time, and I'm glad that you guys have had such success. And I was happy to be a very small part of that, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks a lot for your help.
Remember, folks can check out Glimpse at getglimpse.com, and it'll have a little video there, and it'll explain how to get this installed using NuGet. And thanks again. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.